Business is the products and services that they sell. Now, the brand is the feeling that comes from the product or services that they sell. How a brand treats people is reflective of how well they would do in business. So your ability to identify, acknowledge, engage, and then connect, those are 4 key things that you can do to separate yourself from the competition.
In 2026, competing on a product alone is a losing game. The winners are the ones who turn every interaction into a memorable, intentional experience.
I find all small businesses, every single one of them have something unique and something great to offer. And once they remember that should help them from becoming stagnant in their business.
Welcome to Canadian SME Small Business Podcast. Today, we are exploring the intersection of art, hospitality, and brand strategy. In 2026, competing on a product alone is a losing game. The winners are the ones who turn every interaction into a memorable, intentional experience. Joining us today is Maurice Davis, founder of Ideas Period, part of Davis Copeland Inc. From creating iconic fashion pieces for cultural legends to a teaching hospitality marketing at Centennial College, Maurice has spent 25 years helping brands transform from static companies into living, breathing experience. He is the creator of the Thought Process Framework, a proprietary approach to turning strategic clarity into market dominance. So let's dive in. Maurice, welcome to the Canadian SME Small Business Podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. Maurice, before we get into the framework, I want to start with something I think a lot of our listeners feel, but might, not have the words for. You know that feeling when you walk into a coffee shop and everything just feels right? The music, the way barista greets you, the packaging, and you keep going back, even though there's another shop on the corner that's cheaper. That is not a product decision, that is a brand pulling you in. But you often say that businesses fail not because of their product, but because they struggle to actually engage their audience. What is the difference between a business and a brand?
Oh, that's a good question. And I've also had that experience myself where you can mention a brand name and it brings a smile to my face. So the business is the products and services that they sell. Now, the brand is the feeling that comes from the product or services that they sell. So I like to think of the brand as the big picture, right? The business is the small picture. And the brand is also the personal and the professional brand. How do they carry themselves, right? What is their service excellence? What are they known for? What do people feel? What do they leave with? What do they tell others? So the brand is the overall experience.
Right. It is the experience that pull people in towards any business, right?
Yes, and not only pulls them in, but makes them return, makes them tell others,
Right.
make them your ambassadors, your Raven fans, because of that whole experience. There's too many places, too many small and medium-sized enterprises that are actually doing business, the transactional. They haven't yet figured out how to get into the emotional space. And what you said is when that feeling that pulls people in, that's definitely a brand and a good brand.
Right.
Right.
And make them a long-term customers at the same time.
Yeah. So the way I look at that is if you have a prospect, right? So you're in business, everyone's a prospect. You turn a prospect into a customer into a client, and then it goes further. A client into a partner, and then a partner into an investor. And the client and the partner and investor is based on the volume of visits, the volume of business that they do with you. Or again, do they refer you to someone else? They're essentially your partners in business because they're so tied to your brand. And not only do they want that experience for themselves, but they want it for others.
Right. Maurice, like we hear customer experience constantly. It's almost become a buzzword in the market. But what you're describing goes deeper than good service or a loyal app. You're talking about hospitality as a business philosophy. And for a lot of our listeners, running small businesses, a salon, a consulting firm, a retail shop, that word hospitality might feel like it belongs to hotels and restaurants. How can every businesses use branding to gain a competitive advantage?
That's another good question. So I have a saying, engagement is key because people drive results. At the end of the day, we're all in the people business. And how a brand treats people is reflective of how well they would do it in business. So the number one thing is you have to have a way in which to say hello, right? So your ability to identify, acknowledge, engage, and then connect, those are four key things that you can do to separate yourself from the competition, using hospitality as your main focus. To me, hospitality is the magic. My background is in hospitality. I used to work for a company called Cintas,
Mm.
and we did uniforms for many hotel brands. And when I was being trained, they would say, "Hey, you got to talk to the very important top officers." They call them VITOs, usually director of operations, hotel managers, and of course general managers. And I did that, but on the flip side of that, I would talk to everybody on the property.
Mm.
I would engage with everybody on the property, say hello to everybody on the property. And I found my champions in housekeeping. And because of that relationship, they would tell me everything I need to know about the brand. And then years later, when I was no longer working for Cintas, I find they would still want to do business with me based on the engagement.
Right. Maurice, can you give us a tangible, like a real world example of a small business, that nailed this and what specifically they did differently?
Oh, there's so many. I don't have one that's small, but I have an experience of the keg. My son and I, we like to have steaks, and it's not the most expensive steakhouse. Neither is the most glamorous. But we had a dinner at a keg at Young and Shepherd, and we asked for our steaks medium well. When the steaks came, they were a bit undercooked.
Mhm.
The bartender first observed and he says, "Hey, I noticed your steaks were not done to your liking. Um, is there anything we can do?" And we said, "No, no, it's okay." We continued to eat. The manager came and asked the same question. We said, "No, it's okay because we finished we finished our meal." Now when the bill came, the steaks were not on the bill.
Mm.
And I said, "Why are steaks why did you take them off the bill? We finished our meal." He proceeds to say, "Well, if it wasn't done right, we felt you shouldn't have to dig in your wallet." Right? And that experience I still tell the story to this day, right? I also remember going to ACC and I was invited to a private suite there, and I was going 2 weeks in a row. The first week I showed up, the hostess took my coat. She asked me what I wanted to drink, and it was a great welcoming experience. Now the key is the second week I went back, she took my coat and she knew my drink and she remembered my name, right? It's just like, wow. But so these things are not only specific to larger businesses, they also are very crucial to small to medium sized enterprises. Remembering a guest's name, a small touch, asking them to return, thank them for coming, ask them to return and bring someone else.
When you treat every interaction with intentionality and warmth, like you transform a simple transaction into memorable brand experience. That's truth, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you or I have similar brand, similar location, similar products and services, then how do we compete? What sets me apart from you and vice versa, right? It's that experience and it has to be authentic, genuine. I read a book and it's called Unreasonable Hospitality. There's about a story about a gentleman, his name escapes me right now, but they had a restaurant in New York,
Mm.
11 Madison Park, and they wanted to become number one restaurant in the world. And they had this feeling of they have this concept of unreasonable hospitality where they would just do the little things that matter. Hospitality does not even need to be unreasonable. It just needs to be authentic and intentional.
Let's get into tool you have built to make that clarity, repeatable. Your thought process framework, and the idea of social intellectual property.
Yes.
I love the phrase, Maurice, social intellectual property, because it challenges something many small business owners believe, that IP is only for tech companies with patents, or, big brands with trademark lawyers. But you're saying every founder has an intellectual property that is living in how they work, how they communicate, and even how they think. What is a brand's social intellectual property, and how can founders define it?
That's a great question. So it's essentially your social and intellectual property is what you do best, what you love doing, and therefore it's what you love doing and what you do best. Therefore, you do it consistently, and it's always different from what someone else is doing. I find everyone, both personal and professional, have a story to tell. There's a uniqueness about them. I have a gentleman that I work with frequently. He's always positive. He's good by default. He listens more than he speaks. He shows up on time. And not only does he care, but he cares enough to make a difference. And regardless of whatever situation he's going through, his default is always good. These traits are specific to this person. So every time I meet this person, this is what I'm in for. And that social intellectual property, it lives in the emotional space, right?
As you rightly said, can you elaborate more on like social intellectual property lives in these? Like, can you elaborate it more?
Well, okay. I mean, it depends on the business. Again, I like to look back in terms of what are they building, right? So in a restaurant sense, they're just passionate about hospitality.
Right.
And that passion is there. They can serve you without you saying a word after so many repeated visits. And of course, they remember your name. They know your preferences, and they truly care about delivering an impeccable, elevated hospitality experience. So much so they'll ask you, "Hey, how was your stay? How was your meal? Right? Would you come back? And would you bring someone else when you come back?"
And this can be applied to any type of business, right? Not only hospitality.
Any type of business. And that's one of the things, you brought up, is that hospitality is not reserved for hotels. It's reserved for every single business. From health professionals, so you doctors, accountants, car dealerships, real estate, again, the goal is to create that relationship where they're your partners in business.
Mm. A clarity of thinking is clearly the prerequisite for distinct market positioning and confident execution.
Mhm.
And what I take from that is, your IP is actually your worldview turned into a system. And building the system is not a one-time exercise. It requires constant refinement, which actually brings us to the principle I know is central to your philosophy, Maurice. Like Kaizen. Let's look at how continuous improvement fuels daily creative work for entrepreneurs. And Kaizen, for anyone unfamiliar, is the Japanese philosophy of continuous improvement through small and consistent action.
Yes.
It's been applied famously in manufacturing industry and tech industry. But Maurice, you bring it into the creative and brand space, which I find really compelling, because I think most creatives and entrepreneurs, like either go big or burn out. It is all or nothing. How can entrepreneurs apply Kaizen to daily creative work?
Oh, wow. So again, they have to lean back in terms of not what they do, but what they're building, the big picture, and making those small incremental daily steps very much impacts the big picture. See, thinking when people come up with an aha moment, it's not just random, it's not sudden. How they get to that point is everyday small improvements or small ideas every day. And then one day when these small ideas they actually compound and it becomes into something different. So daily practice of small improvements such as Kaizen is very crucial, is very essential. And it actually lifts the load because you're not trying to do everything at once. Consistency daily.
Right, right. And what does a Kaizen-driven creative morning or worksheet actually looks like in practice? What would you tell to someone to do differently who is starting tomorrow?
sometime. Okay, so based on the consistency, always look for ways in which to improve.
Okay.
I often have these aha moments, and I probably have a ton of them after this podcast where I left and I said, I should have said this or I should have said this, right? So even if this goes well, is having a different thought process of what else could I have said? How could it have gone even better? How could we reach more? So just think of ways in which that you can reach, just make correct myself. So think of ways in which that it could actually go better, right? And when I came up with the thought process, the thought process is not that you should work with me per se. The thought process is, did you think of alternative ways? Did you think differently? Changing the status quo,
That's right.
right?
From doer to thought leader, right? It sounds simple, but it requires a completely different relationship with your own expertise. Maurice, what mindset shift helps an owner move from seller to thought leader?
That's a good question. So the seller focuses on selling products, right? A thought leader focuses on experience, points of views, points of interest, the bigger picture. I would always, going back to my Cintas days, I'd always go to these properties. I never went to sell. I didn't know the prices of stuff, right? And in some cases, people would ask me, "Well, what's the price of what's the price of this?" I said, "Wait, we don't even know if it meets your needs," right? So it's having a bigger view, showing up on time, engaging, listening to what your partners need in business, what their challenges are, and then come in with some solutions. And this is key too as well. Even if you don't offer that solution, even the solution, someone else offers that solution, but you're listening, you're willing to tell them, and that changes your mindset from a seller to a thought leader.
Right. What I'm hearing from you, Maurice, is that the brand is really a reflection of the founder's willingness to grow publicly. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you a question that is really personal to a lot of our listeners because many of them are sitting on a brand that used to feel exciting and now feels a little stuck. They know something needs to change, but they don't know where to start. What advice would help an entrepreneur revive a stagnant brand?
It's a great question. So I would always like to point back to what are they building? Not what they do, but what is it that they're actually trying to build? And I consider it like I have a metaphor for it. It's like a multivitamin. You take one vitamin, you get 5 different minerals in it. So number one is their number. Like lean back to what are you building? What's that number? Right. And then their why. What is the why for that number? Then the third thing is their vision, right?
Right.
And then of course, with all that, they need a plan. And then to wrap it up, which most people don't talk about, is their health. You got to look after your health. So when they lean back and they look at these things, it should always help them to be forward thinking, right? Look towards the future and avoid that stagnation in the brand. I find all small businesses, every single one of them have something unique and something great to offer. And once they remember that, that should help them from becoming stagnant in their business.
Right. That's a great reminder that boldness and intentionality are the best tools to ignite your brand's growth. Maurice, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, my pleasure for being here. Thanks for having me. And then, and I'm looking forward. Hopefully, you can have me back, and we can dive deeper into branding, entrepreneurship, and business.
For sure, 100%.
Okay. All right.
That was Maurice Davis from Ideas Period. A masterclass is why creativity and hospitality are the most underrated business assets in the modern economy. Thank you for tuning into the Canadian SME Small Business Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and visit CanadianSME.ca for more resources. A special thank you to our partners, UPS and ADP, our HR partner, for their ongoing commitment to empowering small businesses across Canada.